The new charges against Donald Trump are renewing concerns about national security and just who had access to the classified documents that the former president was refusing to hand over and, at least in one instance, was showing off. Joining me now is the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, Congressman Jim Himes of Connecticut. Congressman, thanks very much for being with us. What do you make of the new charges that have been added on to the Mar-a-Lago allegations?
Well, they're not surprising because, of course, at their core, they show that the president allegedly engaged in a cover-up, right? Which is interesting because that in and of itself is a very, very serious crime. But it also, and, you know, I'm not a prosecutor, but it also shows evidence that the president recognizes that what he did was wrong. And, of course, his defense, he's had a variety of defenses, but one of those defenses has been that, like, hey, no, you know, I declassified these documents. There's absolutely nothing wrong. You know what? When you start talking about erasing security cameras and that sort of thing, it's pretty clear you know that something was wrong.
And talk about the man who fueled the lock-her-up chants about Hillary Clinton and her server, who's doing more against Jack Smith now. The whole sort of lack of reality of all of this.
Well, I mean, it's the ultimate exercise in projection, right? The Republicans take the majority of the House of Representatives, and they set up a weaponization committee to look at whether Joe Biden is weaponizing the Department of Justice against his political foes. This is after a 4-year presidency in which each and every day, pretty much, President Trump encouraged the FBI to investigate his political opponents, in which he was impeached because he held aid to Ukraine, a country that was soon to be attacked by Russia. He said to President Zelensky, and we all saw the transcript, unless you give me dirt on Joe Biden, you're not getting aid. So, I mean, I could talk all day about this, the daily abuses of federal authority of the Trump administration. And, of course, guess what? The weaponization subcommittee, all of the conspiracy theories and fever dreams of Jim Jordan and the MAGA extremists here, not one shred of evidence, not one.
Well, now we do have the Hunter Biden case, and I do want to ask you about that because the prosecutor now says that the investigation into the business dealings, which presumably include Burisma and or China, and possible involvement, strongly denied by the White House, of the president or then vice president or former vice president at some point of the United States. So using the name, the Biden name, to make money, basically conflict of interest. Now, he's a private citizen, and so I don't know if there's a legal issue here, but they're using that as a predicate for an impeachment inquiry.
Right. So let me say something that you never heard a Republican member of Congress say in the 4 years of the Trump administration, which is that if Hunter Biden broke the law, he should be prosecuted. And it is clear that he broke the law with respect to taxes and possibly the ownership of a handgun. He should be held accountable for that. If he traded on his father's influence, he should be held accountable for that. And I'm emphasizing this because you never, ever heard a Republican say the same thing about Donald Trump or his family. Now, to the question about impeachment, there is today zero evidence that Joe Biden, the president of the United States, knew about what his son was doing. If he did know about it, if he participated in that, then that is a very different conversation. And if the president of the United States committed the kind of offenses that in the Republican fever dreams they're saying he committed without any evidence, I will also be in front of the camera saying that the president should be held accountable. But you know what? There is, at this point, zero evidence that Joe Biden is guilty of anything. What the Republicans are doing, of course, is they're just very, very angry that their guy got impeached twice, and so they're just casting about for a way of revisiting retribution on the Democrats, and this is their latest fever dream.
I just want to play what the Speaker of the House said, because you know that they have a majority and they control the Judiciary Committee, which can start an inquiry. Let's watch.
I said impeachment inquiry. There is a big difference, and let me explain it because maybe not everybody understands it. What impeachment inquiry does when you vote on the floor, it gives you the apex of power of Congress. The federal government says there's still an investigation of the Bidens. Well, the only way you'll be able to get information that way is to have the strength to be able to get the documents you need.
Now, you know as well as I that once you start an inquiry, you have a vote. And unfailingly, you know, in the case of Richard Nixon, it prompted him to resign before he was convicted in the Senate. But so you can't stop that train once it gets started.
Well, look, I generally come down on the side of let's let the truth out. In other words, if there is the possibility of evidence of wrongdoing of any president, let's let the truth out. Again, that is something you never heard a Republican member of Congress say in the Trump administration, but let's let the truth out. And why am I confident that we should let the truth out? Is that every single conspiracy theory, whether it's that the president helped his son in Ukraine, in Burisma, turns out not to be true. When they say we've got a witness that is going to show that Joe Biden got leniency for his son, the Trump-appointed prosecutor says it is not true. It is not true. It is not true. It is not. So generally speaking, I'm saying, fine, let's get the facts, because the facts inevitably shut down the conspiracy theories of people like Jim Jordan. And look, what you just saw Kevin McCarthy doing is a balancing act. He can't afford to alienate his MAGA extremists. So instead of saying there's no evidence that the president has committed a crime that would qualify for impeachment, he says, well, we're doing an inquiry. We're going to do an inquiry because we just want to see if there's evidence. That's Kevin McCarthy's job today, which is pacifying his most extreme element.
Jim Himes, Congressman Himes, thank you very much.